I am Anthony Carpy. I'm Dean of Research. At the college, John Jay's Office for the Advancement of Research is proud to host an ongoing series of faculty who have written books. In our latest installment, we are hosting Professor Evan Mandery, whose topic has particular relevance for us. Not only does his book, Poison Ivy, highlight a set of circumstances that are reinforcing the problem of growing inequity in our society, but it also presents our own institution as part of the solution. Before I introduce Evan, let me just thank a few people who were really instrumental in making this event come together. VP Katura Parker, Head of Communications Kira Pawlowski, Megan Serrazzo, and Rachel Friedman. And I also want to thank the John Jay students who are going to share their story with us later on. So it's always great to have some of our own back on campus. So thank you guys. Now let me move on to Evan. Thank you, Evan, for speaking on a really important issue for us. Evan's bio situates him as an ideal commentator on the issue of the utility of private versus public colleges. He's a graduate of Harvard University and Harvard Law School and makes his current professional home here at John Jay College. He is also an Emmy and Peabody Award winner, the author of 8 books, and has contributed pieces to the New York Times, Politico, The Atlantic, and other venues. In addition to the issue of educational equity and access, Evan is a scholar of constitutional law and civil liberties and a leading expert in the death penalty. His book, A Wild Justice, The Death and Resurrection of Capital Punishment in America, has been received with wide acclaim. His latest work, Poison Ivy, How Elite Colleges Divide Us, is an exploration of how so-called top colleges, the Ivy Leagues, and similarly wealthy institutions perpetuate inequality by primarily offering acceptances to the children of privilege and then ushering graduates into lucrative careers where that privilege is sustained and reinforced. Public universities, like CUNY by contrast, are engines of upward mobility and change. What comes through in this book is that in addition to his scholarly accolades, Evan invests a tremendous amount of time in his students, not simply as a teacher, but as a mentor, a confidant, and a friend, supporting them throughout their academic and professional journey. I look forward to learning more this evening. Please join me in welcoming Evan Mandery.
This is Amanda Zhu. You'll meet her
in a moment. She's going to help me out. There are a few people that I couldn't have done this with. I just want to acknowledge two. One is my wife, Felie, who you may know from the sociology department, but literally every idea in this book I've discussed with her at length, and her sociological imagination suffuses it. And Amanda, who's now a paralegal, was better than my professional editor. And it's so, all of the students you're going to meet are extraordinary, but just wanted to start by acknowledging that. So this is a story about us and America, and I'll leave it to you to interpret who us is, but it began on a bet. I was at dinner with a friend of mine, and we both were from Long Island, and both had gone to Harvard, but we diverged greatly on our feelings about the institution. My friend was an alumni interviewer, gave money, and regularly showed up for his reunions, and I did not. And I think kind of why we diverged is because of our life stories, and I'll just briefly tell you about mine. I grew up in Brooklyn. That's me with Elliot Harkavy. I think that's my 8th birthday party. And this is the apartment. My mom and dad are here today. That's 3202 Notion Avenue, which is near Marine Park. And when I was, I spent weekends with that's my grandfather. I used to ride the subways. And when I was 12 years old, we moved to a middle-class suburb in Long Island. Thanks to the miracle of the internet, I can show you everything from everybody portrayed in the book. So that actually is our house, though it's presented a little more nicely than I actually remember it, and our living room. And I was a bowler when I was in high school, and My mom was a Spanish teacher and an actor, and my dad was principal of Brooklyn Tech, which is where he went, and it's where he still works, and it's where I was bar mitzvahed, and where I'll be buried. With their support, I made it to Harvard. That's me and my dad, who is very sadly, I think, 14 years younger in that picture than I am today. And that's the president of Harvard, Derek Bach, who's actually a real force for good in the educational world. And I think that's graduation. And then I stayed for law school. I don't have any good picture of law school, but this is it. And I worked as a litigator for a while. And then I came very happily to John Jay. Both of my parents are CUNY graduates. I didn't actually have a massive understanding of what CUNY meant when I came here, although it's obviously, I'm quite passionate about it now. And it is true, I think what Anthony said, my students can tell you, but my dad took me to high school when I was 5 years old, and I was thrilled by a classroom, by the chalk on the blackboard and the little things of Linden's chocolate chip cookies that they had in the cafeteria. And I still am literally excited every time I walk into a classroom. But Vali and I, our children, for some interesting reasons, ended up living in a suburb in Long Island, and Carol knows it. She grew up nearby. And I took a train every morning, and I see that train ride as a metaphor for my life. At one end was a reasonably affluent suburb, Manhasset, and you get the picture. And at the other end was John Jay, and you get the picture. And because I'd spent my whole life around educators and in schools, I spent a lot of time thinking about what separated the lives of the people that I lived with from the lives of the students whom I taught. And the chasm between those universes is massive. I've been at John Jay, this is my 23rd, I've been here for 23 years now. And I've taught precisely one rich white student in my entire career. She's a professor now at the University of New Haven. She's wonderful. But you know, plenty of you teach here. I don't teach a lot of rich people from the suburbs. And by contrast, nobody from Manhasset will end up at a college like John Jay. The story that my friend told is actually a movie, From Homeless to Harvard. If you're a parent and you want to feel a little bit better about your parenting, you should watch it, because in the pivotal scene of the movie, the main character, Child Protective Services, is coming to take her away, and the father, who's high on heroin, continues watching Jeopardy. So even Vali and I have cleared that low bar with Maddie. And another story that some of you may know is from what I think of as from Conakry to CUNY. And you'll meet Abdullah, for those of you who don't already know him. But Abdullah's story is, to my mind, the theoretical maximum of upward mobility a human being could achieve. Abdullah grew up in a poor rural village in Guinea, came to the United States not speaking English, taught himself English, and worked his way through CUNY while working as a messenger. He was distinguished himself on the first day of class. I taught them Kant. Some people complain about reading 5 pages. Abdullah read the entirety of the Critique of Pure Reason, and that's Abdullah and me at his graduation from Fordham Law School, and this is his beautiful family. And Abdullah is today a public interest death penalty lawyer at the Phillips Black Project. And I guess the question is, which story is more representative of Harvard and of CUNY? Now, when my friend and I had that dinner, he attached a lot of weight to the Harvard Financial Aid Initiative, which was, basically every elite college has something like this, but if you made less than $65,000 a year at the time, Harvard would let you go for free, and they obviously trumpet that fact on their website. And I said that that begged the question of how many Harvard students came from families making less than $65,000. At the time we had our dinner, the median income in the United States was about $53,000. So theoretically, if it were proportionate, about 60% of Harvard students should have come from families making less, and it was nowhere close. So here are the schools in the United States with the lowest percentage of students coming from the lowest income quintile. So at the time, we settled our bet using data from the Harvard Crimson. It was subsequently our collective understanding of opportunity in America was immeasurably enriched by a massive study undertaken by the economists Raj Chetty from Harvard and John Friedman from Brown, who I interviewed and discuss in the book. And this is data from their study. So at Washington and Lee, 1% of students come from the bottom income quintile. And at Princeton, it's about 2%, ranging to the Ivy Plus colleges that are defined as the 8 Ivies plus Duke, Stanford, University of Chicago, and MIT. MIT comes out as the best of the worst in a lot of metrics that you're going to see over the next 20 minutes or so. And here's the flip side of that picture. So at CUNY, the only college at which students from the lowest income quintile are underrepresented is College of Staten Island. They're massively overrepresented every place else. And of course, you remember MIT was the best of the worst at 5%, and College of Staten Island is still coming in as triple that. Now, the key metric that Chetty and Friedman used for their study is mobility rate. And they defined mobility rate, obviously there's infinite ways to slice data. They defined mobility rate as the product of access times success. Access was percentage of students admitted from the lowest income quintile, and success was success in promoting them to the top income quintile. So there obviously would be lots of ways to do well. You could let in lots of poor students, or you could let in a few students and be really, really good at getting them to the top income quintile. Here are the, this is 12 actually highest mobility rates in the United States. CUNY are 8 of the top 12 in terms of upward mobility. We come in 5th. Now, you'll feel even better about these numbers when you see what those comparable statistics are at Ivy Plus colleges. So one Princeton graduate out of 100 is a person from the lowest income quintile who makes it to the top income quintile. Now, in some respects, this story has already, sorry, so this is what the movie poster really should have been, from Scarsdale to Stanford. In some respects, this story has already been told. You've probably read this data. The New York Times has covered it extensively. David Leonhardt wrote about it. And you probably, all of us who either go or work here, had a sense that we do a really, really good job of promoting upward mobility. But I looked at the data a couple of ways that people hadn't, and I think it tells, it enriches the story, or maybe impours the story. So I looked at how good elite colleges are at keeping rich kids rich, and they are spectacularly good. So here's a ranking of colleges by students from the top income quintile, the top 1%, which I think is about $630,000 it takes to get there, and the top 0.1%, which is 3.2 million. At Harvard, 15% of students come from the top 1%, and at Lynn, a college, actually, I thought I knew every college. I hadn't even heard of Lynn, maybe you have, but SMU, I mean, that's about a 350 times oversampling of it. And at John Jay, Carol saw me present this number one time. She questioned that 11.6 number. It does seem high, but you'll see that when we get to the top 0.1%, there are very, very few students, and effectively none, who come from families making $3.2 million a year. I know this will shock the students that are in the audience. Now, so I created another statistic, which I call the stability rate, which is a different product of access and success. It's access by people from the top income quintile, and success is keeping them in the top income quintile. And now you're starting to get a ranking that looks a little bit more familiar to us. So 54 Princeton students out of 100 by their 10th reunion are rich people who remained rich. But there's one, and this is kind of, it's good to just visually see this once in your life. This is a totality, an overall picture of birth prospects and outcomes from the Chetty and Friedman data. So if you're born as a top 0.1 percenter in the United States, there is a 15% chance that you'll end up at an Ivy Plus college. But for choosing to go to work or illness, there is effectively no chance that you don't end up at a selective college. By contrast, if you're born into the bottom 20th, the bottom income quintile, there's a less than 0.5% chance that you'll end up at an Ivy Plus college. Now, I still don't think that that's the complete picture. So I have another statistic, which is a measure of what I call the top floor and the iron ceiling. Elite colleges are unparalleled when it comes to promoting access to super elite and super wealthy. So top mobility rate I defined as people who came in from the top income quintile and success in promoting them to the top 1%. That describes approximately 1 out of 5 Princeton graduates. A total of 23% of Princeton graduates end up in the top 1%. And we know why. And it's not a secret, but of the couple of hundred books that I read over the past few years on education in America, this one is my favorite. It's by a sociologist named Lauren Rivera, who embedded herself at a management consulting firm. She calls it Monitor. And what she finds, number one, is that consulting firms and investment banks and elite law firms will only hire students who come from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania. They don't even like to go to Stanford because they say it's too far to fly. And when it comes to selecting among those students, they overwhelmingly pick people who look like them in a variety of ways. What they want are, as she puts it, people that they can have fun with and play with. So college experiences like lacrosse are very predictive of success in that job market. And it's important that people bump their head on the iron ceiling. So a story I tell in the book is of a young man, many of you may know. He's our colleague now, Nico Montano. And if Abdullahi was the theoretically maximally upwardly mobile college student imaginable, Nico is the most successful college student imaginable. Nico grew up in East Ramapo, which is a spectacularly underfunded school district and the subject of a wonderful episode of This American Life. But Nico came here and he got himself a marshal. And after getting his 2 graduate degrees, he returned to the United States and worked for a criminal justice think tank and wrote a grant, a multi-million-dollar grant. And after they landed the grant, presumed that he would run it, and then the administrator told them that they were hiring somebody from Yale Law School to run the grant. And Nico was also a committee member. The Marshall has made some efforts to diversify. I mean, it was effectively segregated before they made these efforts, but they have made some efforts to diversify. And Nico was on a selection committee with a crusty investment banker. I'll leave you to guess his race. And they were evaluating the merits of a candidate who had gone to CUNY, and the investment banker said CUNY isn't serious. And Nico revealed at that point that he had gone to CUNY, and the investment banker was unpersuaded, and he continued to favor somebody who had sang in a choir at the University of Chicago, who he thought would do very well in the similar choir at Cambridge. And I think this is an important part of the story because there is one line of attack to critiques of elite institutions, which is that they statistically represent very small numbers. And that is true in some sense, right? There are very few graduates of elite institutions, and certainly as a percentage of the total population, it's small. But John Friedman said to me, and I completely agree with this sentiment, that they end up being the leaders of all of the major policy setting institutions, right? Everybody on the Supreme Court, all of the management committee at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey are dominated by these people. So diversification of access to the elite is something that has national policy consequence. But we know the barriers here, right? And, it's said in plain sight, and I'll let you hear it from an old familiar face.
Good afternoon. My name is Christina Stutt. I'm a 1L student here at WCL. I have a more general question, and that is that part of the American ethos is that our society is a meritocracy where hard work and talent lead to success. But there are other important factors like connections and elite degrees. And I'm wondering, other than grades and journal, what do smart, hardworking WCL students with strong writing skills need to do to be outrageously successful in the law?
Just work hard and be very good. I'll tell you a story. By and large, unless I have a professor on the faculty who's a good friend and preferably a former law clerk of mine whose judgment I can trust, I'm going to be picking, for Supreme Court law clerks. I can't afford a miss. I just can't. So I'm going to be picking from the law schools that basically are the hardest to get into. They admit the best and the brightest, and they may not teach very well, but you can't make a sow's ear out of a silk purse.
Sorry, I should have given a trigger warning before I introduced him. But so here's the overall picture that the Chetty and Friedman data shows us. So one way of visualizing, this is just on the need to diversify investment banks and management consultancies. If it's 10-year out data. So if you were sitting at your 10th Princeton reunion and looking around the room at 100 people, 54 of them would be rich people who had remained rich, and 23 of those 54 would be rich people who had been promoted to super wealth. One would be a poor person who made it to the top income quintile. So the story they tell is about the one and not about the other 54. Now, there's a whole lot of books about people talking about how college is overblown, and I'm sympathetic to that in some sense. But I actually think upper middle class and upper class, mostly white people, accurately perceive this reality. Elite college attendance, an elite college degree is a basically perfect insurance policy against downward mobility and the near exclusive promoter to a certain type of elite status that is familiar to academics. And people adjust their lives accordingly. The standard life course for an affluent family is to live in the city until they have children, and upon having children to either send the kids to private school or to move to an affluent suburb. And when they move to an affluent suburb, what people are doing is chasing two things. The first is wealth. So this piece comes from a wonderful nonprofit called EdBuild that did all these maps that represent segregation in the United States. This is the most segregated school district border in the United States. The red one is Rochester in New York, and the blue is Penfield. In Rochester, 10% of the students are white, and 47% live in poverty. In Penfield, 84% are white, and 5% live in poverty. There are 671 borders in the United States between districts with greater than 20-point differences in poverty. And here's a phenomenon that is pretty cool. This is the Island School District. The EdBuild folks identified 128 districts which attempted to or successfully seceded from other school districts, which is always about local control and trying to hoard assets. And this is one of 180 island school districts in the United States. In the middle up there is Piedmont, where the average family income is $300,000 per year. And the surrounding county is Oakland, where the poverty rate is 24%. What families are also doing, and this is the massive disparity between white and black school districts. White school districts are very small, and school districts that serve students of color are very, very large and underfunded. The other thing that families are chasing is access to narratives that elite colleges arbitrarily choose to value. I could go on about this, but one of them is sports. So here's the Johns Hopkins lacrosse team, and here's the Yale alpine ski team. If any of you are inclined to donate, you can go online and give the money. They really need it. This is the overall picture of representation in sports in America. Now, the only sports that are really shown on TV are Division I college football and Division I college basketball, and they are highly diverse. But by the time you get to the Division III equivalents of those sports, they're overwhelmingly white. And when you look at niche sports, well, they're almost entirely white. So at Harvard, Harvard runs 42 sports programs. 70% of recruited athletes at Harvard are white. 3% of them are from socioeconomically disadvantaged families. And of course, these sports are just not equally available to all. Obviously, equestrian is extraordinarily expensive to play. These are all pay-to-play sports. And if any of you are in the sports universe, you know that recruiting has shifted younger and younger, which makes it essential to participate in a club so that you could be seen by a college coach. And the other thing I just want to ask is how colleges shape student lives. America makes a massive investment in elite colleges. The last estimate by a sociologist at the University of California, Merced, was that collectively the tax breaks are worth approximately $20 billion a year. Contributions to a college are tax deductible. The earnings on the endowment are tax deductible. Almost all of those colleges are exempt from state property taxes. This is a massive investment that the United States makes, and well, what do we get in return? So obviously not an engine of class mobility, an engine of class stagnation, but maybe you would feel differently about it if elite colleges were really good at taking rich kids and making them do-gooders. Well, that's not what happens. About 60% of Harvard students go into management consulting, investment banking, or the tech industry. When I went to college, it was law and medicine. Those aren't affluent enough anymore. And that little blip at the bottom is for education, which is between 2 and 3%, almost all of whom are people who go to work for Teach for America, which is a 2-year program. And while there's not a lot of data, I have a lot of anecdotal data that they don't stay in it for their career because my dad has spent his whole life in education, and I think I'm probably the only one he knows who took his Harvard degree and went and became a public educator. Here's what we do by contrast. Depending how you want to define public service, 2/3 to 3/4 of John Jay graduates go into public service. So if you meet a teacher or you meet a police officer or a firefighter, chances are pretty good that that person went to CUNY. Now, the story that elite colleges tell is that they're just reproducing what students want. And in fact, it couldn't be further from the truth. A wonderful sociologist, Amy Binder at UC San Diego, did a ton of research on entering college students' career preferences. And basically no one goes into college wanting to be an investment banker. They're high achievers and they're responding to incentives. And after college career services fail to give them any obvious medium to high prestige alternative to working in investment banking or consulting, they go down this path. But she just walked in. You'll meet her in a few minutes. There's a woman, Crystal Salvati, who is at Penn Law School, and she's a public interest scholar. So as her mentor, I told her that it was very important that she make nothing in her life, and she took my advice. But that's what separates us from them. I would say even worse than that is the story that elite colleges tell about our students. So I wouldn't be great but at least it would be honest if elite colleges said, look, we're not profit maximizers, we're not as bad as Shell or ExxonMobil, but we're status aggrandizers. And we're in a race to be the first college to get to $1 trillion endowment, which Harvard will get at, depending on how the market does, sometime between 2100 and 2120. Instead, the story that they tell is that their students are the best and the brightest. I have a better clip than this, but I can't get it on video. At Stanford's convocation, John Hennessy, I have the text of the speech, tells everybody Stanford's admissions office doesn't make mistake. But this is pretty good. This is from a Princeton convocation.
All of you have been blessed with exceptional talents, and your time on this campus is itself a great gift. When 4 years from now, you graduate from Princeton, you will find it easier than most people to be successful at whatever you pursue.
Thank God, right? Meritocracy is a double-edged sword. So if we say that students at elite colleges are the smartest and hardest working and most deserving of their status, then by necessary implication, we say that the students at public colleges are less hardworking, less intelligent, and less deserving of their status. And if any of you have worked here for a week or 23 years as I have, boy, you know that our students are not less deserving. And the work ethic that we see among their students, I mean, I'll go on about this later. I mean, if you think it's not predictive of capacity for success and success, well, it's just false, but they tell that story. Now, is there a possibility for change? Well, they kind of say they're just riding the currents of history. They're a victim of underlying inequities in society. I would say that they're much more causal drivers of inequity of society than they like to admit. Of the 100 largest nonprofits in the United States, 26 are a college or a university. Collectively, they control assets of $500 billion. Now, let's look at how Harvard's endowment is $52 billion. Let's look at that, how that's distributed. Here are endowments at the colleges with the highest stability rates. These are the colleges that are most in the business of keeping rich kids rich. By the way, Princeton's endowment, Princeton's a pretty small college, so some of you may have read Malcolm Gladwell's piece. Princeton now has an endowment of approximately $4.5 million per student. So at 5% interest, that would be $220,000 per student, or about 3 times what they need to actually do to run the college. So he calls it a perpetual motion machine. And here are the endowments at the colleges with the highest mobility rates. This is hoarding of the worst kind. It's offensive, and it doesn't stop. So this is, Malcolm Gladwell is actually a real force for good in this universe. And here's a conversation he had with, an excerpt from a conversation that he had with Stanford President John Hennessy, asking whether it's ethical for Hennessy to continue to raise money.
Do you ever imagine that a president of Stanford might go to a funder and say, at this point in our history, the best use of your money is to give to the UC system, not to Stanford? The UC system is the University of California system. 10 schools: Berkeley, UCLA, San Diego, Davis, Santa Barbara, etc. Maybe the finest group of public universities in the world. Stanford has 16,000 students. The UC system has 238,000 students. So I'm asking John Hennessy, might there ever be an instance where he might tell a would-be super philanthropist, look, we've already got $22 billion in the bank, higher than the output of 2 Caribbean countries, and it's earning us a couple of tax-free billions every year. Your dollar would go further at the public institutions down the street, since they educate 222,000 more students than we do with a fraction of the endowment. I'm not holding Hennessy to his answer. I'm not looking for him to make a solemn pledge. I'm just asking.
Well, that would be a hard thing to do, obviously, to
turn them away. And I think the other question we'd be asked is, how can I have confidence that they'll use my money well? Which we're obviously, the President of Stanford is not in a position to vouch for, I think.
So I just want to end with two thoughts. The first, I conclude the book with a story about Robert Frost and a speech that John Kennedy gave at the dedication of Robert Frost Library, and a frame that the Ford Foundation president Darren Walker uses and Brian Stephen talks a lot about, which is proximity to suffering. And if any of you go to school here or work here or have spent your entire career here as I have, I don't believe that you could possibly be unmoved by what our students overcome to achieve their educations. I mean, for God's sake, if any of you went to any of these places, stop giving them money and start giving your money here, because we can do a ton more good. And I don't want to cry, but this book would not be possible without a whole group of students. And there are a couple of sets of students I learned a ton from. Some of you may know that I taught this class at Appalachian State, and I wrote about it, and they were just so mature about kind of understanding the story that I was trying to tell and let me do it. And I don't know how it feels to never having had anybody write a book about me, to have somebody tell the story of my life, which I could see is complicated in many ways, but Abdullah is here and Crystal is here and Hannah, and they each tell such important points of the story. And we did a seminar together, and they read all of the chapters of the book. And the intellectual contribution, Amanda, I'm serious. Amanda was so much better than the person who edited the book. But I'm changed in the deepest way by having lived here. And Valia always jokes that I wasn't a class warrior when she met me. So she did it. But I sure am now. And boy, those institutions, they are not forces for good. And I think they're forces for great harm. And even if you disagree with me about that, I don't think anybody could, reading my book, I think it's irrefutable in this sense. I don't think anybody could think they shouldn't be doing much, much more than they are. So I'll just close by telling you a story about the woman sitting next to Amanda. That's Brianne Ortiz. She's not here today because she's a 1L at Northeastern. She called me yesterday to say, remember that thing that you told me, it just happened for the first time. And that was her interacting with rich people. And, spoiler, she didn't like it. And Brianne graduated a year early from high school. Many of the students here know her. I think fair to say that we all love her and think she's an extraordinary person. And when we were talking about her career, I said, well, why don't you take a gap year? And she basically didn't really know what I was talking about. And then we talked about what she might do with it. And I said, well, what do you think about when you dream about your own life? And she said, I don't allow myself to dream about my life. I never have. And, everybody understands race and class status differently in their own way. And the way I understand my own privilege is that I was interested in telling a story. And I sat in a chair. My daughter will testify. I sat my butt in that chair every day for 3 years. And I was like, I'm going to tell the story. And that's an extraordinary privilege to have that intellectual freedom. And my book is in the hope that that opportunity will be equally available to all. So thank you.
Thank you, Evan. What a great presentation. Now that we have a broad sense of the book's premise, we're going to move into a moderated segment to talk a little bit more about the book's focus. And joining us for this, let me welcome, or more correctly, welcome back, Dr. Dara Byrne. Dara has worn many hats at John Jay, professor of communications, former interim chair and director of SEEK, founder of John Jay's Macaulay Honors Program, Dean of Undergraduate Studies, and Associate Provost for Student Retention, and has, while in that role, founded many of our student-focused programs such as ACE, CUSP, LEAP, Seeds, and many others. And now she's the Dean of Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York. Please help me in welcoming.
Hi, everyone. So, you know, they limited me to about 15 minutes, and if you know me well, you know that's just not really going to work. So I just want to take 1 second to say a couple of things about the book before we get into the conversation with Evan and with some of the students that are featured in the book. If you look up reviews about this, you'll read that this is a searing takedown of elite colleges. When I read the book, what I saw was a love letter to John Jay. It is, if you work here, if you go here, if you have been as committed to John Jay as I have, you will see yourself and your passion for what he describes as 1% solutions, about doing good, making change, show up all up through these pages. If you've had difficult experiences through the pandemic, if you've been frustrated by things that have happened in your classroom, challenges getting to school, questions about moving forward, read the book and you will find all the love that you need to find about why it is we keep doing what we're doing. So first, I want to say thank you to you, Evan, for writing a love letter to John Jay.
I just want to say, so Dara threatened me with physical harm if I tried to do a farewell party for her. But I want to say thank you to you. At a personal level, aside from Lily, I've learned more from our conversations than any other colleague, and for your contributions to this college. And I'm so glad that you were able to be here today. Thank you.
You know me well. Thank you. And I wanted to start there because you're going to, the book is artful. And when you get to know Evan, you know how versatile he is in a number of ways, but his scholarship, his voice is artful. He's also a jazz musician and plays trumpet. And you know, a trumpet in a jazz band announces itself. You know it's there, it's proud, it shakes things up, and that is exactly really the right kind of metaphor for what happens in this book. But it's also instructive to someone like me, who is the new head of a very young college that is only 21 years old and trying to figure out how to offer the best of what public education can offer without replicating elitist practices. And there's a lot of guiding in here that I take very near and dear, and I hope one day I get to look back on this and say I've done the things or answered the call to change or the challenge that is in the last chapter of this book. But it also expands beautifully on this idea of what a 1% solution is. And for the folks at John Jay, you know that sometimes in our budget, we only have enough to do 1% of the work. And in the last few chapters of this, you will see how important that 1% is, and to move away from the idea that every solution needs to be perfect. But I want to start first by asking you, Evan, if you could talk a little bit about the process behind the book, because your style of scholarship, and if you haven't read Wild Justice, please go do that. His style of scholarship is very different, and there's an art to it. So if you could talk a little bit about your process and some of the choices that you made, such as involving students and talking a little bit about yourself in here. I'll just say, for example, on the first page, he talks about this experience reshaping his views of opportunity in America. How do you tell that story?
First, I want to say that the jazz metaphor, Ben is here, so since there's actually a good jazz musician here, I'm cringing at that, and if you saw me play the trumpet, I'm the exact opposite of playing music because I'm so lacking in confidence about what I'm doing. But I do love music, and I definitely hear music when I write. So I think Lee and Maddie will testify that, like a crazy person, I sit there saying things to myself. I think my students will say I'm very interested in people writing in a way that can be understood. I think a version of that question you could ask me is, was I more invested in it being a good book or in the cause? And that's a tough one. I'm glad you didn't ask me that. Thank you. I'm really, really invested in it being a good book. And I think that people can only relate to these stories in a human way. And I don't think anybody remembers the data, but I know that you'll remember the feeling of reading Afterlife's story or hearing it, or Crystal's story, or Hannah's. And you know, ultimately stories are about whether we care about the characters. So, and I think you have to think that I'm a credible, minimally likable person. You know, I'm a novelist, so I was able to create a fiction about it.
Thank you.
That was fun. I heard that. Yeah, you're actually an excellent.
So in the book you write, no elite college comes anywhere close to producing public servants at the rate of CUNY and Cal State. And public education is almost never a career choice for elite college grads. Of Harvard, Stanford, and Yale graduates, 2%, 3%, and 4% respectively enter education. The lion's share of these join Teach for America, which requires only a 2-year commitment. The overall picture could hardly be clearer. The CUNYs and Cal States of America produce our nation's teachers and public servants. The Ivy Plus colleges produce investment bankers, management consultants, and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Now, what types of 1% solutions do you think that institutions can put in place to expect more balanced outcomes for graduates?
This one's really achievable. There's lots of not so subtle mechanisms by which elite colleges steer kids into money-making careers. You know, if you end up at one of these places, and obviously many of you went there, you're a high achiever by nature and you respond to a certain type of incentives. So the genius of Teach for America is that the founder, who's a Princeton graduate, right, simulated a competitive process. So if I make people think teaching is a status thing, then they're going to respond to that incentive. But the preferred seats at all of these career fairs go to the places that are offering the most money. They seduce people into a baller lifestyle. And this is very, very hard to overcome. My dad's sitting in front of me. So, you know, one of the touchstones of my life, I'm definitely like an underdog guy, as I remember sitting at Christmas and our cousin, who owned a greeting card company, would ignore my father. My father, take my dad any day of the week over that guy. My dad has spent his life educating people in public schools, and he thought that he was better than him. And crap, but I think when you understand the heuristic biases that this type of student is responsive to, it takes a lot of work. But by the way, here's an institution that's premise is doing social justice. You don't think that that filters down to our students in some way?
And that is woven in and through the book, this idea that it should be part of the mission of these colleges, and that is another kind of opportunity gap, right?
For sure. Or let's stop sending them $20 billion a year. So either let them get on board with trying to make the world a better place, or they're profit maximizers and let's just treat them like Shell.
So you say, my hunch is that elite colleges won't accept this book as an invitation to reassess their commitment to socioeconomic diversity. They'll say that they already do what I've called upon them to do. They'll say that it's not their responsibility to remedy American society's problems. Most of all, they'll say, he doesn't understand endowments. Malcolm Gladwell recently called Princeton the first perpetual motion machine because even the size of their endowment at almost $38 billion, they have enough money to both fully fund the university and have enough remaining to invest and further grow and expand their endowment. You talk a lot about this concept in your book. What do you think are some of the solutions to that kind of problem of the richest schools getting richer? And do you think they bear any responsibility to start reinvesting that wealth outside of their own institutions?
Well, needless to say, my answer to the last part of that question is yes. I think, I know people get turned off by math, and it's very, very hard to have a sense of big numbers. But I just want to put into perspective what we're talking about. Harvard has an endowment of $50 billion. I think if it were the GDP, right, that would be an annual flow thing as opposed to an asset thing, they would be about the 32nd largest country in the world. Harvard and Yale, they have a uniform spending rule. They spend approximately 4.5% of their endowment every year. Even during the pandemic, they didn't change that. So the notion that it's a rainy day fund is a myth. Let's say they boosted their spend down rate from 4.5% to 5.5%. Their endowment would still continue to grow exponentially. They would still reach $1 trillion. It would just take them another 20 or 30 years. So what does 1% of $53 billion look like? Well, that's $530 million a year. Do you know what the operating budget of John Jay is? It's $200 million a year. So you could run 2.5 John Jays for free, and we're twice the size of Harvard College. So how about Harvard Detroit and Harvard, where? Pick a community in New York. El Paso. How about tripling the capacity of these colleges and dedicating the lion's share of those additional slots to socioeconomically disadvantaged students, so they can still let in their 7 Andover graduates a year and their 8 Exeter graduates a year. We'll just dilute their percentage. We'll see when I do this at Harvard whether anybody claps.
So, I would love to bring the students who were discussed in this book up here, or to, I can move the microphone. But before I do that, I just want to mention something, and this is not because I'm now the dean of Macaulay, but the Macaulay Honors College comes up a lot in the book, and there are at least 3 students that are mentioned who are Macaulay students who came through Macaulay at John Jay. Many of you know that I was the director who worked with a lot of you in here to launch that program, something that I'm very, very proud of. But it's also important to know that when I was reaching out to schools in the name of John Jay to go to high schools and recruit, the elite high schools in New York, except for one, Brooklyn Tech, wouldn't even let me in the door. So I have a lot of appreciation for the way that I was treated, because the idea of John Jay starting a program that would be an important pathway for students to get the very best of what CUNY has to offer, and by best I do mean resources, of talking about the challenge and the commitment to think about the common good, your connection to justice, how you will serve and what you will do with your gifts when you get out there. I couldn't even get in the door at most of the schools. And Evan does talk about the idea of how these pathways start earlier than just in the college journey. It is starts much earlier than that. And so we will get to see what it looks like when we are doing this kind of work to elevate our students to the kinds of places where they can really take the mission of the college and move 1% change forward. So I'd love to speak with some of the students, the former students, after they are a whole adult, so I can't really say that. And Crystal is a law student, Hannah and Amanda. So what's interesting about this book is that the students played, or the former students played a role in shaping it as well. Would you, I can look out the way, would you, you should.
We all like each other.
Would you tell us a little bit about the experience of being involved in the shaping of the love letter to John Jay?
I guess we'll have to start.
Can you pull the mic closer?
Check. Is that loud enough? Loud enough?
Yes.
Thank you. So I remember the day I met Evan. It's in, I think, room 119 or 18, Westport. It was a Friday around 11:30, 11:45. So I had been at John Jay for a year because I accidentally ended in the honors program, as explained in the book. So usually I didn't speak in class because I'm, naturally introvert, and English is not my first language, and it was sloppier then than it is now. But when Evan came in and sat on the desk, never in the chair, Evan does sit in the chair, on the desk, looking at the class and asking silly questions, I couldn't stop. I had to speak. And so he came and started asking questions. He said, raise your hands if you wanted to get A for this class, but the condition is that everyone else will get a C or an E. You want to get that? So that's a hard question, right? Who's going to say that? But, some people would be happy to get it. I get an A and I move on. He started asking questions like game theory. I never heard of game theory before. So he asked this question about the dollar question, right? It's a dollar game. Is that people bid to pay for $1. How much can you give to get $1? And the studies show that people give as much as 125 or 135 cents to get $1. And so these questions were so interesting and just intriguing that I forgot about my, embarrassment to speak in public, because they at first appeared silly, but it was at the core of the class. And this class was about what is wrong, what is right, what is good. And we started with these silly questions, and we had an overview of, ethics over the millennium. And so that's really where I started admiring Evan, just as a professor, right? But then that moved on to Evan as a friend, as an advocate, and that's something that maybe you're going to talk about after you say something about the experience.
Does this one work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to say similarly, that was probably one of the first moments I realized that this class was going to be different than any of the other classes I would take here at John Jay. I would honestly say that my time with Evan Mandery has completely shifted the way that I think about society, just my own thought process. So after taking that initial ethics class that was a requirement for the honors program, it encouraged me to go above and beyond. Like any of the other classes that we took afterwards weren't really a requirement. There were classes that we took in our independent time, and I felt like I learned more through my relationship with Mandery than I have in, you know, the courses that I would need for like my specific major. So yeah, that's all I can say about that experience. That it was, it shaped my experience, and I wouldn't ask for any other college experience because, like, my mentorship with it kind of shifted how I think about life.
I would say that my experience kind of mirrors that. There was, I also remember the first class that I had with Evan. It was intimidating to say the least because you know you know the person at the front of the room is brilliant. So you want to get the answers right and that kind of thing. But I have to agree with Hannah. It really changed the way that I thought. And there are some things, I actually am working for the federal defenders in Pennsylvania in the capital habeas unit, and there's some metaphors from Evan's of Wild Justice that I still use today. And a lot of those lawyers are interested in reading that book, so. So it's very, it's been extremely valuable.
Okay. To echo what the other three have said, I think it's a choice to want to take Evan's class. Regardless of whether it fits into your schedule, there's so much more that goes into the choice to actively participate that everybody else here has done, and everybody else has made that decision to want to learn more, to want to push yourself, because that's a lot of what class Evan has been, at least in my experience. I think I've become a much better writer, much hopefully better speaker through this experience, and also just a better person.
So I'm going to ask you all something a little hopeful. Again, I think of this as a love letter. Evan describes you all as some of the hardest working people he has ever met. And so hardworking people get hard questions. In the book he writes, and this is the final page, it's a call for action. He also talks about young people as those for whom revolution is really in the hands of the young. He says, I call upon you to act as an agent of change, to fight within your residential and academic communities, to soften borders and create opportunity, to change the narrative about merit, to inhabit the reality that neither affluence nor poverty are deserved, to fight boarding and reject tokenism, to be generous and just, to know the midnight, to demand that the entirety of the hundreds of billions of dollars raised by elite institutions with the support of Americans be used to fuel the American dream, not thwart it. To demand that your alma mater and community change, not in 25 years, but today. And so I ask the hardest working people he knows, as you reflect on your then and now, in the context of this masterful storytelling of the opportunity gap and your relationship to it, how do you see yourself in relation to this type of call to action? Y'all know I have to ask that. Don't do that. Don't do that.
I don't have to answer this one first. Well, I think for me, the most important thing is that Evan has been an advocate for us because I see this book as an advocacy book. I don't see it as much as criticism of early education institutions, but as Evan saying, look at my students, right? These students are as good as your students. They work as hard, and they can do a lot of things if they're supported. Us and those who are coming from institutions like John did. So he's speaking for us, and now we should speak for ourselves, but also for others John did. And one way of doing that is giving example, right? Is that when we see students of John Jay or students of CUNY, right, is to say, yes, you can do it. Because I remember the first time I was asked to apply for an internship, a scholarship at John Jay, an international scholarship. I couldn't, in the statement was, the question was to write about yourself, right? It's all I needed to do is I have the good grades, write about yourself, tell us who you are, and you get the scholarship. But I couldn't tell them about myself. But I thought there's nothing about my life, about my experience that's worth telling. But after I met Evan, you know, I learned with him and from him. I realized that I have a lot to say. And I remember when I wrote my personal statement for law school, I always asked Evan to read my writing because he's merciless and he's so
Often on committees with Evan.
So he read it and he said he cried. Right? And there's nothing in that letter that was new compared to when they asked me to write about myself the first time. Right? I had the same experience, I had the same life, but I didn't have a voice. And the power of an advocate sometimes is not just to speak for others, but to give them voice. And he's given me that, and it's an opportunity for us to do the same thing for others. So I taught at John Jay before I went to law school, and this helped me a lot. You know, with the students, I would tell them, you know what, I was in this classroom like you, an international student, I wasn't born speaking English. Most of you grew up speaking English. If I did it, you can do it. And I think little things like that could empower others to advocate for themselves and for others.
I would have to say that for me, my journey started with the notion of representation. Growing up, I was in a predominantly white community. I had an interest in the tech field, but I had no one to look up to as that being a possibility for females, for people of color. I remember when we were Macaulay freshmen and we were dressed up to meet President Mason, we had to speak about what we wanted to do, like what our goal was. And I said in that room that my goal was that I wanted to be a representation for other people that look like me in the tech field going forward. Obviously looking back 4 years from now, I would not think that I would achieve that goal. But I've started a software engineer job in the tech industry for Grubhub this year. So I'm
You make more money than I do.
yeah, so if I was telling freshman me that, I wouldn't believe it, but it was only possible through my connections here through Macaulay, through John Jay, and the mentors I had during that time. I don't know if I would be able to be in this path that I was without what I learned in the 4 years that I had at the school. But now that I'm there, at least starting my journey, my goal now is, what's next? Like, how do I become that representation and continue that path for other people so that they can look at people like me and know that it's possible for them? So, obviously, right now I'm learning. I'm in my first year of tech, but I hope to succeed in the future and be able to figure out the best way of where I can, create something where I can give back and show that it's possible, whether you're whatever race or gender you are, that you can achieve whatever you want to achieve.
I know that Evan put a little bit of this in the book, but a lot of why I went to law school was because I wanted to advocate for folks who couldn't advocate for themselves, or rather in my personal statement, that you very nicely mentioned that we had to go over 13 times, but it's how I would have wanted to be advocated for when I was younger. So that's kind of how I see myself in the world more broadly. But I did find this book empowering and very, I don't know how to explain it, but when you start 1L, a lot of the questions are like, oh, where are you from? What school did you go to? That kind of whole thing. And I always found myself explaining what John Jay was. I found myself explaining what Macaulay Honors was. And there was a bit of shame with it, even though I was trying to represent like this was, you know, one of the greatest experiences I've had. And then I read the book and I didn't feel like that shame anymore. So it was empowering that it released that for me. Because I know that I'm just as good as these other folks, and the students that I was,
You're much better.
the students that I was surrounded with here are just as good as these other folks, and so that was really helpful.
First of all, I also, sorry, want to apologize on behalf of my high school. I went to Antelope High School, and I did not know that we did not open the door for you. I ended up here anyway, and I'm very grateful for that experience. And I think that also like brings up this question of like equity and access to the degree that like all of my friends from high school, everybody else attended a private university outside of New York. Nobody else considered CUNY. And I think that was like very eye-opening for me, and it did, you know, in the same way I think bring up like a little bit like shame, you know, like there's this stigma against going to like public school in New York, and I think it's about taking up more space in that sense, and you know, like advocating for yourself, because like Crystal, like I don't know, I think I'm kind of okay compared to everybody else, and I think that like it just boils down to having like more space and more access for CUNY students.
I just wanted to say, just, you know, people take from the book what they take, but how happy I am and those formulations of it in Crystal's. Hannah's story, when you read the book, is such an essential part of the book. It's the emotional core of the book for me. Because it goes to the story that rich white people tell about poor people of color, which is that they fail because they're lazy and not as smart. And you got the picture. If these people had my parents, they'd have gone to Harvard, and if I wouldn't have overcome what they have overcome. I mean, I know more about their stories than I reveal in the book. I couldn't have done this. And I think, but what I do share with them, I felt the thing that you can only feel when you enter into a rich elite space. And I always used to call it the Harvard thing. My parents have heard me talk about it. So I would debate somebody, and I think I hold my own. Oh boy, it wasn't that they disagreed with me. I was stupid for having believed what I believed in the first place. And it is gaslighting. It's a type of gaslighting. You're like, oh, I'm worse. And obviously my book talks about race, but it's much more about class. And I was the wrong class when I went to Harvard. I was definitely very middle class, and I amply felt imposter syndrome. I was very, very worried about it. And I hope I'm empowered, because I think, to what Crystal said, right? She formulated it as I was good. No. She's so much better. She's so much more resilient. And the story that people, you know, who work at Taco Bell to get through college, that's a stigma. That's not a stigma. Those people work 40 hours a week and then do what they do academically. it's a massive sign of indicating success. And there's a sociological frame that I only know because of Ali, and I'll spare you. But Bourdieu actually talks about it as a type of class violence. And it is. It's a violence that's done against these people who are every bit as smart and as deserving of their position in society.
So I want to see if there are any questions from the audience for Evan, for our students, former students, sorry. Any questions? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, so I don't really have like the research and numbers, but given that your decision, or rather your outcome in college is going to depend on the opportunity to college provides you as opposed to what you into it. And then, so with that, how will more funding and opportunities help the fact that we're, as much as I love this college, we're being funneled into public services and governmental positions where at best, you know, middle class, upper middle class, in comparison to the rate of people being funneled into finance and tech positions where, yeah, like even if it's the same rate of opportunity, the money is still being held largely in one demographic. And the mortality rate on average, you know, just spitballing, is probably going to be higher within this demographic as opposed to the other. Of course, you know, no answer is perfect, but that's my question.
I'm directing it here.
Well, I think a solution, right, there's not going to be a simple solution to this problem. So there has to be some raising of the floor and lowering of the ceiling, and there has to be a change of the narrative. So funding of public colleges is essential. Please God, if you know anybody with $1 billion, tell them to give money to John Jay. We'll do a lot more with it than Harvard will. And they also have to take less, right? Because, you know, if we get another $100 million, but they get $1 billion, we're still falling behind in the race. And there's going to have to be some acknowledgement that excessive hoarding is just grossly unethical. And then there has to be some changing of the narrative. And that's what I perceive to be essential in my book. I promise you, if you go with me to the Harvard Club for a talk like this, the first thing, actually, my friend is sitting in front of you, she just related me this story where she asked a question about this whole Harvard admissions officer, and somebody said, but what about quality? You should see the emails I get. And the idea is that they believe they deserve their status. And that's an essential part of changing this, is they don't deserve what they have, you don't deserve what you don't have.
There's a really great part in the book that talks about the difference between what is generous and what is just. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at, obviously read the book, but that part in particular is a really great way of thinking through the questions. Any other questions? I know that I'm supposed to be wrapping up soon.
One quick one.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. So frustration against elite institutions might make for some strange bedfellows. Can you talk a little bit about maybe, you hear like some Southern conservatives are passing laws to get at endowments that speak to some of the same frustrations that are being expressed here, but your perspective is might be different from theirs. Can you talk about how they might be aligned or the differences?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I talk in the book about how Trump very skillfully exploited antipathy of elites on his pathway to the presidency, and that's a page he took out of Adolf Hitler's playbook. But Trump's critique, and this may be the only regard in which he's right about something, is grounded in an element of truth, which is, you know, if you remember that chart, what your chance of ending up at an Ivy Plus institution is if you're born into the bottom income quintile. So how can people trust the elite if it is utterly inaccessible to them? So I've written like a half dozen pieces over the past month, but I had a piece in Politico about the tax break. And I'm so glad you asked this question, because it's coming one way or the other, right? There's antipathy for elites from the right and from the left. And the question is whether the left can embrace it and actually leverage it for change. So Trump put a 1.6% excise tax on endowments with in excess of some number per student. And all that was punitive of, people who voted against him in the same way that the limitation on state and local taxes was. That needs to be leveraged for change. We need to say to Harvard, okay, in exchange for your $2 billion in tax breaks, how about you meet this minimum threshold of Pell Grants? I get the craziest emails. Somebody on Twitter, somebody tweets at me, well, Princeton has 17% Pell Grants. And I'm like, yeah, John Jay has 72% Pell Grant recipients, and Princeton's endowment per student is about our endowment, right? So I think this is something that Democrats have to embrace, is the reality of these gross disparities of using federal tax policy to change it.
Sorry, I read your piece in Politico. Thank you all so much. This is really wonderful. Thank you to the students too. It's a real privilege to work here with colleagues like Evan and everybody else, and with your students. But I read the piece in Politico, and I was just wondering, why can't they give half of their tax break? Like, if they get a $2 billion tax break, why can't they give half of their tax break to us, $1 billion, to CUNY?
They should. I don't think that's a silly question. I mean,
don't either.
I think these institutions, nobody's asked about affirmative action, right? But these institutions are the beneficiary of slavery, and they've perpetrated segregatory housing policies. They owe debts to the communities in which they're situated. So how about Harvard sets up a partnership with Bunker Hill Community College and lets in 20 transfer students per year? Do you know how many transfer students they let in? Effectively 0, and the number that are coming from community colleges is really 0. So of course, that's a commitment that these institutions should take seriously. They don't take it seriously at all.
Just keeping it in New York City, I'm under the impression that the city controller has been putting forth the idea of pilots, and I'm not sure if anybody here knows what those are, but they are payments in lieu of taxes. So NYU doesn't show up on the list so much, but certainly it's a wealthy institution, especially in property, and nothing compares with Columbia University. And if they really are not having to pay taxes on the properties that they own, it would start right here at home.
I'll just acknowledge, I'm sure I made mistakes. I have a piece in the Harvard Crimson today, and they pointed out that it was 26 of the top 100, not 25. I missed Duke because the corporation is called the Gothic Corporation.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, my name is Nate. I'm in Corrections 320 with Professor Alpha. Thank you. In the last 10 years, there's 4 million less students in college, and I doubt that those 4 million students are missing from elite colleges like Harvard. I think they're missing from schools like John Jay. And I'm wondering, do you think that trend will continue into the next decade?
I mean, there's so much to say about what you said. I mean, who suffered during the pandemic? Well, of course it's socioeconomically disadvantaged students. But did the hoarding stop during the pandemic? You know that Harvard took CARES Act money before they were shamed into returning it. And there literally is nothing that they won't stoop to. I mean, you've heard that quote. At what point do they say we have some duty to help our neighbor?
I'll just tell you that for the work that has been happening at John Jay, speaking to 1% solutions, and some of the people who funded those 1% solutions are in the room right now, sometimes averages out to about $300 will prevent a John Jay student from dropping out of college, right? So when you receive gifts, contributions of $150,000, you transform a whole lot of lives in a way that until you see it and you do that kind of work, as many of us have done in this room, it is shocking to know that $300 can mean the difference between a degree in hand or none for the rest of your life.
The data is like overwhelming and conclusive on this. If you want to improve student outcomes, you put money in their pocket. The concern with debt forbearance, debt avoidance, has nothing to do with student outcomes. And you know, this figure will shock you. The amount of money that Yale spends per student is between $150,000 and $175,000 per student. We spend about $15,000 per student. And that disparity, so if you think about the marginal utility of those extra dollars, what they're buying, second study abroad opportunities, 6 tutors, and you think about what our students need to get by, right? Those $300 can make a difference in pocket. And, you know, it is part of the problem because the hoarding makes it more expensive to fund college for underprivileged kids. Who really, by the way, we can talk about this another time, actually really needs to be paid a small amount of money to go to college, because if you spend $85,000 a year to send your kid to Princeton, it's not costing you really $85. It's $85 plus the opportunity cost of your child not working the minimum wage job that they have. And no upper class family is going to have their kid work in the fast food industry, but if you're starving, you might. So you might actually miss that $600 a month that they can bring home.
Well, thank you. Folks, thank you for being here. One quick second. Please read the book. You will gain so much appreciation for the hardest working students and what it is that we do to support and sustain them and to contribute to meaningful change. It is an elegant book, it is a thoughtful book, and probably one of the best ways to spend a weekend. That was me, guys, rather than So we're having a reception right outside that everyone is invited to. There are food, beverages, good treats and things like that. But there's also an opportunity to continue speaking with Evan and the students, and I would really encourage you to do so. Thank you so much for being here.
I want to thank all of you all for coming out tonight to celebrate this wonderful book that our own Professor Evan Mandery has written as Dean Byrne, or I guess, yeah, she's still Dean Byrne, even in her new role. I had to think about that. Even as Dean Byrne said, this is a love letter to John Jay. And having been hearing him talk about this book and his excitement about it coming out, and being able to sit in the lecture today and hear about this book firsthand from the author, meet the students who are featured in it, see his parents and his family in the photographs. It's been, you know, a wonderful story to see how it's all come to be and to learn things that we all need to critically think about. That's what we do here at John Jay, as the students said, learn to be critical thinkers about the information we're learning. I had the good fortune 2 weeks ago to hear a lecture by a political economist from the New School talking about the wealth gap and that question the young man answered about how do we ever close that wealth gap. Evan is giving us a start to figuring out how to close that wealth gap. And it's multifold. It's investing in places like John Jay and also having those folks with it learn to give up just a little of it. A rounding error, as he articulated, a rounding error would make a significant difference in what happens here at John Jay. But to that young man's question about, you know, the opportunities that our students don't have, I'd much rather you all have the opportunity to change the world, which you do by coming to John Jay, there you go, and getting the education you get here at John Jay, because the policies that Evan talks about in his book that need to change will only change because of the students here at John Jay who are going to be in those halls of power when those policy decisions are made and making those changes. Those folks in the banks, they're not going to make those changes, but you all will. And having the opportunity to have the kind of education you get from professors like Dr. Evan Mandery, excuse me, I know better, Professor Evan Mandery. Yeah, he and I have the same affliction, we're lawyers. Professor Evan Mandery, you ought to be a doctor because you put out more research than some other people. But having the opportunity to learn from him, and not just learn from him, the students that I'm moving around because you're in different places, I remember you. And when you made that statement, and to be able to see you living into that dream, that's what Professor Mandery does. That's what Professor Trench does. Where's Professor Schneider? He was in here somewhere too. That's what he does. You know, that's what our professors here do, and we are so lucky that Professor Mandery put it in writing and memorialized your stories, memorialized the differences that happen between those with and those, and I'm not going to call us those without, those with and those who are going to make a difference in the world. Don't ever think of yourself as lacking. Where's Crystal? Don't ever think of yourself as lacking anything. As he said, you all exceed, and I'd put you up against any student anywhere, any day, and you will excel. Not will excel, you do excel. And so don't ever let anybody make you think differently about who you are and what your potential is, because we're counting on your dreams. And so I want to thank Professor Mandery and welcome him up here and thank him for his brilliance in being able to articulate your stories with such passion about why this institution is so special, and thank you for staying here for 23 years. So please join me in welcoming him back up front. Thank you.
Well, you're stuck with me for as long as I make it, because I'm not retiring. So I just say briefly how proud I am to be associated with an institution like this. My dad is my hero, and my dad has spent his entire life in public education, working to elevate people. When I went on the job market, I don't know, I suppose if I had gotten a job at Kansas Law School or something like that, I might have gone, and I wouldn't have known what I missed, but I'm so glad I didn't miss it. And I like it as much 23 years as I did when I started, and all of my students, I think what they are ambassadors of justice and of the power of public education, and I'm so grateful to all of my colleagues who share a vision of an institution dedicated to doing social justice. So thanks all. I also want to say how grateful I am to John Jay. This is kind of like my idealized version of a university, people getting together to discuss a book. It's very nice that it's my book, but I'm just so grateful that we had this conversation, and thank you.